We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Arthur Woods. He's the co-founder of Mathison, social entrepreneur, author, LGBTQ plus leader. I had the privilege of seeing Arthur speak in person at HR Transform. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thanks for having me, Christina. I'm Arthur Woods. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. And when I was growing up, I wanted to be a pilot. And I'm in the air a lot, but I'm not flying a plane.
There you go. There you go. So, when push comes to shove, maybe you could do it. I always love asking that question. You fast forward today. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point to be the co-founder of Mathison and wear all of the different hats that you wear on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. Well, to start out, I grew up in a single parent family. I was in an evangelical community. We were very poor growing up. When I entered college, halfway through college, I came out in the LGBTQ community. And honestly, Christina, I felt as though I was kind of breaking rules, whether it was in life through the lens of religion or it was socioeconomically being really different at times in the communities that I was in. And I found myself resorting to entrepreneurship because it was sort of a way of writing your own rules, of breaking the mold. And when I entered my very first corporate job interview, I overheard a homophobic slur from my interviewer.
Oh God.
And not a fun experience. And I found myself, in this interesting mode of realizing that in many places in work, we don't feel safe, we don't feel our full selves. And I actually started to think much more about the fact that, wow, work is now where we spend the majority of our lives. And if we have people who are showing up and not feeling that they can be their full identities, that they feel safe to be themselves, that they feel safe to speak up, it really not only is a detriment to that individual, but if we think about it, it's really a detriment to society, right? People not being their full selves in their jobs where they're spending the majority of their lives, it's a detriment to the rest of the world. And this really got me on a path of thinking about how do I innovate in the workplace? How do I create environments and systems and help create communities where people thrive and they can bring out their full selves in what they do every day?
Yes, absolutely. How can people thrive? How can we set them up for success and really create that psychological safety as well at work? We spend so much time there, as you were talking about. Number one, thank you for sharing your journey with us. And number two, I'm sorry that that's something that you heard throughout the process as well, in terms of creating spaces where this doesn't happen and there's opportunities there for folks to do their best work without having to experience this. What is necessary to create that psychological safety at work? I know a lot of people are talking about it, but how would you break that down?
Well, first and foremost, we talk about, and I know you and I have talked about these 4 stages of safety. And I think a lot of times people think that, wow, I make the people around me feel included. I'm creating a safe environment. Inclusion is only stage 1 of these 4 stages. And that's just that we are seen as ourselves. We feel welcome to the table. But stage 2 is where we create environments where people can learn. And that's really where, we're safe enough where we're actually growing. We're getting out of our comfort zones enough to take in new experiences. Stage 3 is where we're actually able to contribute. And that is where I feel safe enough to raise my hand, to ask a question. But it isn't until stage 4 that we are safe enough to challenge. And it's that challenger state that is actually at the heart of how we innovate, right? Because if I'm on a team and I see that something could be done a little bit better, or that maybe I can contribute something, then that's enabling us to be better. Challenging state is also pretty important because there have actually been examples of plane crashes, for example, where someone didn't feel safe enough to speak up, and therefore it led to a catastrophic event, right? So we think about the fact that building safety up to this challenging level is critical, not only to how we innovate, but truly to how we make sure that everything goes well. And as leaders, the thing that we believe we can do the best is step in and be vulnerable. and be willing to listen and signal to our teams that it's safe for them to contribute at the level that we're all aspiring to here. And so for leaders to show up and be willing to share your personal story, be willing to to admit to not knowing, to actually invite contribution from your teams, and proactively do that, not just assume that they know, like actually inviting it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leadership piece is so important and really inviting folks to that conversation, proactively asking specific questions, and really cultivating that environment where people feel like they can contribute. It's not only a nice to have, but a need to have for the business, and everybody feeling like they can do their best work again as well, spending so much time there. I know one of the hats that you wear too, and reading through your bio and seeing the work that you do, is that you're an author, and the book that you wrote around hiring for diversity, the guide to building an inclusive and equitable organization. So important. This is a conversation a lot of folks are having and questions being asked at their organization. Can you tell me about, some of the specific policies or practices leaders implemented that you've seen that really reduce that bias and improve accessibility in their company's hiring strategies?
Absolutely. So the first piece of this is being really vocal and transparent about your diversity commitment, because so many organizations today, they're on the DEI path, but they're not making their commitment or their DEI efforts at all transparent to their communities.
Yeah.
And that's not ideal, because we can't assume that job seekers know our commitment. In fact, we did a poll recently and found that only 8% of job seekers from underrepresented communities are clear on an organization's commitment to diversity when they apply to the job, right? So there's a huge opportunity there just to be vocal and transparent about our commitment. The second is, when we are drafting our job descriptions, we're thinking about our role requirements. We not only need to be thinking about inclusive language and how we're writing to be inclusive and accessible to all audiences. That's not just reducing our gender coded terms, and it's not just ensuring that we write with accessible language, but it's also making sure that we're not using language that could be really perceived or interpreted in any kind of exclusionary way. And the language that we use is so important. It sends a signal to every single community. When we think about our role requirements, a lot of times we look at setting a very high bar on things like credentials and years of experience, as a way of weeding people out. And what we do in a sense, every time we set these exorbitant requirements, is we essentially limit the pool to very homogenous. So we really think about stress testing. Anytime we put a high credential requirement, is that absolutely necessary? What are the transferable skills we could have that someone could exemplify that had an unconventional background that could still meet the job requirement? And then the final thing that we say is most critical. We have 45 different things we assess, but the one that is most critical, that typically goes overlooked, is the interview process. And how us having a structured, consistent way to interview, because if we think about it, it's where we spend the majority of our time in the hiring process. It's typically one of the least structured parts of the process, and it's usually the thing that leaders most kind of conventionally improvise. And so, because we've all interviewed people so many times, right? We usually make it up as we go. So the more that we can take a structured, consistent, rigorous approach to interviews, the better.
Absolutely. Really being intentional and thoughtful about how we are interviewing, what language we're using in the interview process as well. The words that we use really matter and send a signal, and really making that public commitment too, for people to know, and also for accountability as well. In terms of really attracting that talent, you talked about the application process, the interview process. I want to ask you a question. I spoke with another LGBTQ plus leader on this series about encouraging employers to ask in the application process around gender identity, and to share if they are part of the LGBTQ plus community. Can you talk about the importance of this, if you feel similarly, also with the caveat that we are not trying to group anyone into a monolith here, and not everybody should have the same perspective?
Yeah, and so the question is sort of how do I think about like whether or not grouping into the community, or sort of identifying, disclosing you're in the community?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to note, especially as we talk about psychological safety, that
Mhm.
first of all, in the majority of states today, it still is legal to discriminate against someone because they're in the LGBTQ community. Um, in many countries, it's illegal to be gay. And so it is, we have, from just a policy standpoint globally, have not set a very strong precedent that it's safe to come out. And we have a long way to go, in terms of really building just environments and places publicly where people feel safe to be gay, because so many folks for so many years and just dating back decades, were beaten up in the streets for being gay, and this is still happening in many countries today, right? And so I think the first thing is we have a long way to go, in terms of just building safe environments for people where they live today. In many corporate environments, the same goes, that discrimination is happening every day. That we see, in many places, individuals have not come out because they're actually afraid it's going to impact their upward career mobility.
Mhm.
And so I think this is a moment where we have to really listen to every single person, where they're coming from, in terms of how safe they feel to identify.
Mhm.
I think it's important that in the application process and in our employee surveys, we give people the voluntary opportunity to self-identify. That's really important because it signals that we see your community. We are here for your community. We're advocates, right? It doesn't require anyone to self-ID,
Yeah.
but it does give them that option. And that's something we do recommend to people that are hiring, is the more that you're able to give people that voluntary option, it does signal that you see the community. But I think it's important to note that, everyone's going to come in maybe a different level of safety, when it comes to self-IDing. And the more that we're creating inclusive environments, that are proactively signaling our commitment to the community, I think we're going to see more and more people, feel empowered to raise their hand.
Absolutely. Having the option to raise your hand and not looking at this in a silo, looking at the historical and societal context is really important as well. And just because someone is not ready to disclose right now or share the information, just having that on the application as an option is sending a signal to, going back to your earlier point of the language that you use, and was present for our employer brand as well. Speaking of, not looking at work as a silo, we don't check our identity or lived experiences at the door. How have you seen leaders really successfully, intentionally, authentically not perpetuate that trauma that happens externally in the world, internally at their organization, knowing that companies are these microcosms of society?
Yeah. There are a few. I mean, I think first of all, leaders recognizing the trauma that is being experienced in the world, and I think for a leader to be able to be very vulnerable and say, I know that you're turning on the news and you're seeing a war happening in Ukraine. I know that, the last 2 years, the racial atrocities that we've witnessed, weigh heavily on people. I know that, the pandemic has created environments where people are not always at their best.
Mhm.
And by the way, we're now more physically isolated than ever before. I think that's changing with sort of coming out of the pandemic now. But we see that this last couple of years has not been ideal for people,
Mhm.
from a societal macro standpoint. And work actually has the environment, the safety in the environment that we create at work has actually become even more important, because people are looking to their jobs now for a sense of belonging and for a sense of aligned values. And so I think this all goes to say we're in this really interesting moment where, employers and leaders of organizations play a really vital role in the lives of people that they're managing and supporting. And I think recognizing, sort of diffusing the drama or the trauma that you're witnessing outside, internally, is all about, again, creating vulnerable, accessible environments.
Mhm.
It's about checking in with people. It's actually about investing time with people. That's a big one. I mean, there was a recent, poll that came out of Qualtrics that found, the employees that are thriving the most, one of the critical, differences is that their managers are spending, at least 4 hours a month with them, right?
Mhm.
So the time that we invest with our people is a critical, component in terms of how they feel, right? How they feel supported.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely.
so those are just a few things to think about.
Yeah, I think that's really important to remember, and people can tell when you are being authentic and you are making that investment in the one-on-ones for your manager in that time, and really asking those open-ended questions and being specific in
Mhm.
what you're naming too of how are you really doing, waiting for the response and actively listening and following up too. And I think this is something we've seen a change to your point as well in what we're looking to our employers for: community, belonging. And with changes, even with the best intentions, people are bound to make mistakes, and that's okay as long as we learn from them and have that growth mindset. What are some common mistakes you're seeing companies making in their kind of organizational equity strategy? Of course, you don't have to name names or companies, but just general patterns.
Yeah, there are a few. I think one of the mistakes is that we should just sort of go underground, try to figure this out all on our own, and not bring our people along the journey with us, right? And that becomes this really interesting challenge where essentially employers are saying, well, let's just sort of not admit that we don't know what we're doing, or let's try to not really communicate with our people or our outside community until we're really far along. And what that does is a few different things. One is it doesn't make the work a collective effort, right? It enables, it pushes the DEI work onto a select few people. And then it makes it so that you are not able to you're not able to take mutual ownership of the work. I wrote a piece in Inc. last week on the fact that DEI leaders are experiencing a lot of burnout, and one of the reasons is they're not properly resourced, and sometimes that means just from a capacity standpoint, they're not given a lot of the resources to from their broader organization to be successful, right?
Right.
The widespread transparency and ownership is a big one. I think the second one is that a lot of leaders believe that there is kind of a silver bullet. If they just do sort of one thing differently, it'll change everything, right?
Checking blocks.
Right, checking a box, and also believing that again, there's kind of one true single solution. And I think the more that we're embracing the fact that this requires holistic work, it requires us bringing everyone on board, and it's going to take a systemic change and not just an individual incremental change. I think leaders start to understand, okay, I need to be reframing the problem itself.
There are individual kind of things and actions that we can all do on a day-to-day basis to be more inclusive, to create more equity, but then there is that big systemic change that takes time. It's not going to happen overnight as well. And you can't just do one thing and say, okay, we're done working on this as well. And that ownership and
Yeah.
accountability for everyone is really important. It's not one person or even a team's job to make an organization more equitable. It requires the part of everyone. Arthur, you are a presenter. You've done these interviews such as this. What's the best question you've been asked recently?
The best question that I was asked recently was, for leaders that are struggling, how much of their, for leaders that are struggling right now with this work and with trying to be more inclusive and empowering, how much sort of comes from their history, their childhood, their previous sort of their previous experiences to inform why they hit some of the roadblocks they hit. And I thought that was a really thoughtful question, which was, so much of how we show up every day is influenced by our own lived experiences, and the experiences that actually define the very identities we have, but also the lens through which we look at this work. And I think the question got to the heart of this idea that we each, part of the beauty, but also the complexity of the DEI work is that every single person interprets it differently.
Yeah.
And every single person has a different, a different identity and relationship to the work itself. And so for leaders, I think that means it's a moment where we have to hold the space for the fact that this body of work truly will be sort of like experienced and lived by each of our team members in a unique way. And that means that, become an inclusive leader has a much more complex, task ahead of them than ever before.
Absolutely. It's very complex. People are complex. Everybody's at a different part of their equity journey, just like leaders and companies, and doing that internal work. And when you mentioned kind of the trauma and just like the intergenerational kind of work that is done as well, everybody's bringing their own experiences to each conversation and the work that we do. I feel like our time flew by. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring a couple key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
I think the last thing I would just say is I love this conversation, by the way. I would say that, first of all, thank you for having me and for the work that you all are leading. It's super important. Leaders right now, there isn't a playbook that has been written that's 30 years old for being an inclusive leader, right? And today, it's not as though we have the longitudinal case studies of organizations that have engaged in this work really successfully. We're all kind of writing the new playbook for what the work looks like. And
Right.
I think that means that the more we're doing this together, we're all in it together. The more that we're looking at, we're looking to have really important, vulnerable conversations. And we're just, also being patient with ourselves and with each other. That's the biggest thing, because this work doesn't manifest overnight. It takes time.
Show yourself compassion, show others compassion, and hold that grace and space. Arthur, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening on AllVoices, we really believe in employers and employees being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.